Good afternoon, everyone. FEMA contractor predicting social unrest and food prices rising by 2020. They studied both types of climate responses, both cool and warm. They had 4 different rounds depending on the effects and the severity starting in 2020. They know the grand solar minimums repeat round 1, 2020. This is going to be affected by the drops in Atlantic temperatures, Pacific temperatures, and the slide off into the new grand solar minimum, intensifying with La Nina at the strongest ever. Round 2 and 3, 2022. Every time this happens with the severity, Chinese dynasties collapse. The Maunder minimum, 1665, notice the lineup of the parallel set of planets. Dalton minimum, 1855, same parallel lineup. 2024, we are in a grand solar minimum, maximum cooling at that point. Round 4, 2028, talks about massive disruptions in Brazil, China, and the U.S. We jump over to Deagle.com, look at the new lineup of the global economies. And how do they know that the UK is going to drop from position 6 down to 36? Advanced knowledge. Food supply disruptions from the food chain reaction, global stability in question. My call is for minus 127 million metric tons during this time. Their conclusion, the new normal is volatility. New article out from a FEMA contractor predicting 4 times food price rises by 2020 as well as social unrest and prolonged crop failures in key food basket regions. So I dug further into the links provided in the article and it brought me to the food chain reaction. Now this was a global think tank of all countries when food supplies affected by the grand solar minimum will happen and what effects it will have on our global population. They studied both types of climate change responses, both cool and warm. These are some major players that put this study together here. High-level officials from countries across the planet. Their main focus was the adverse weather shocks from declining solar activity and productivity of our crops globally. They just predict weather-related disasters, social unrest, and they broke it down into 4 categories, being round 1 through round 4. In the years 2020 to 2021, serious global instability from food shocks. Looking back in history, we know every time there's a grand solar minimum, there's starvation and famine. It's easy to see the pattern. 79 AD, Vesuvius erupts. Look at the pattern, parallel. We come up to the Maunder minimum. We get the same parallel lead in to the grand solar minimum. Dalton minimum, 1855, also the same parallel pattern. And we're going to repeat that coming in 2024. The governments of the world have put this study together because they expect food shocks and how they're going to handle it when people riot in the streets for food. Interestingly, it starts in 2020. Here's my forecast that I did 6 months ago, the crossover line after the planets roll onto a single quadrant, and the Earth is behind that, 2019. Cooling of the entire planet will be so in your face by 2019, and then it intensifies through 2020 as the planets line up in 2021. Then we come up to 2022, 23, 24, and this will be the coolest bottom minimum for a couple of years. We'll get out of this same pattern at around 2034. These cycles are easily measured. Theodore Landscheid does a mathematical model. You can easily see that these match up. You can see when they're going to occur and what the intensity will be. So round 1 at 2020, they actually give you the countries where the food shocks are going to occur. Australia is going to lose about half of its wheat harvest. The United States, corn and soybean decline. And global crop production falls 1%, although I think they subtracted a 0 to not make that so scary. I would say 10%. The full cooling begins the winter of 2019. You can easily match that up with cooling ocean temperatures in the Atlantic, the La Nina in the Pacific, and we are going into a grand solar minimum, so this solar activity is going to all decline. 3 declining factors. This La Nina is going to be one of the strongest in recorded history. It's on a 60-year cycle in the Atlantic. The forecast coming out for the bottom of this La Nina is probably going to extend past February, and this chart might be a little off because there's a lot of new factors with the grand solar minimum. La Nina weather patterns going to be greatly affecting the northwest U.S., Canada. Looking at longer term cycles, you can see the sine wave easily in the Gleisberg cycles. This brings us up to 2022, where they call out China and India experiencing severe droughts, Russia and Ukraine heat stress. Let's change that to cold stress reduces grain supplies. We'll look on the map here, and if it really does get that cold that it affects Ukrainian production, then that entire area north of 50 North goes offline. Now, watching the video they put out, I screen grabbed here. They're showing North Africa as one of the key areas. They actually, in their handwritten notes, grain shocks in Asia. Chinese must be terrified because every time a grand solar minimum comes, their society falls apart. All the emperors changed every single time one of these events rolled through. Looking at Chinese grain production, anything above 40 or 45 North is going to go offline there. They lost a huge amount of winter wheat due to floods this year. This is the Chinese version of the handwritten notes. 2028. This time they include Brazil, China, and the U.S. with severe droughts. Significant crop failures at that time. Notice the handwritten notes behind Brazil, not online. What they do plan to do is move over to Africa and turn that into a breadbasket. You can see the yield's going to be up 16% when it gets wetter over there, just like the Chinese have been planning for so long, buying up desert areas knowing it will get wetter. Now, how did they have all this advanced information? India's corn production going to take a severe cut, 50%. Also, the other crops grown in India with drought and floods across are going to be reduced. Areas across the United States where wheat is anything above 45 North going offline. Handwritten notes, they're talking about biofuels in California and Florida. I left a link below for all the PDFs where I pulled this information. The year 2020, the world's food system is under increasing stress. Yeah, extreme weather from grand solar minimum effects is the reason. Shortages, skyrocketing food prices, social unrest. So the reason they brought the 100 global leaders of food production and distribution together to work this out of what would happen during the grand solar minimum food shortages is they want to see how the current systems of delivery are going to operate under stress. Their conclusion, the new normal is volatility. Now, when we look at political instability indexes as well right here on the map, very high is going to encompass a bit more of the globe. Key findings out of this particular study were instability in the food supply. Climate change going cold going to affect the food supply. There's going to be a united global effort bringing in a new global government. Agriculture research and development with new GMO crops should be put into place to harden it against crop stress for cold and wet and dry. Information sharing, they're going to be changing some of the IP laws for survival for our species. And the long-term solutions require a global government. The primary findings are food insecurity. We need to start with smart agriculture. And instability and volatility are going to pervade our societies. The food chain reaction study covered these critical gaps. Knowledge gap, sharing information, the productivity gap, where we're going to be able to grow our foods or not because of the cold, and also the collaboration gap, because when some countries have food, they're not going to want to share it with others. Handwritten notes again, climate change circled. They had all these things, but why did they specifically circle climate change? Because when we go back into the grand solar minimums and we just look at the famines associated with each one, let's say over the last 800 years, we'll look at the famines of 1340, look at the famines of the 1630s in the Maunder minimum, we'll look at the famines of the 1840s in the Dalton minimum, and they know it's coming back again. The wild card in this is the solar activity decreases, our magnetosphere, and every single grand solar minimum, there is a major volcanic eruption in the VI 6 or 7, which blocks out the sunlight and further reduces global yields. My prediction for this, by the time we get down to 20, 21, and 22, and I put this out 7 months ago, was 127 million tons down. And now this study comes out and cites the exact same dates for global food losses. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. If you're in control of the world's governments, you're going to need to control the population and control the decline. Now, how would you do that as a government to control the people and control the situation? First, you're going to need to stop global migration of people by ushering in the greatest stock collapse in human history, or at least since the Roman Empire. You are going to need to militarize all nations. You'll need to prepare emergency supplies for the continuity of government. We jump over to Deagle.com. This is the list of the current top 10 economies on the planet. But when we come into this 2025 forecast, you can see we live in an entirely different world at that point. And these people, using all the think tanks available to them to put out these forecasts at Deagle.com, how do they know the UK is going to drop from number 6 down to 36? Did they know in advance the Brexit vote was coming? How do they know that they would just drop off the map in terms of an economy? As the playbook rolls out, your global financial collapse will stop all migration. You will have no money to move to another country to set yourself up when your country's food fails. Terrorism being used as the excuse to militarize all countries. There's government agencies in the United States where postal workers are issued AR-15s, the same weapons they're trying to ban for the citizens, yet we're arming our government. Billions of rounds of ammunition. This explains that. They're going to need to try to globally keep the continuity of government intact. Speaking of the financial collapse, I have been saying for over a year and a half, when the financial collapse comes, you have a 1 year before the global food yields decrease where it's so in your face and you'll be asking questions why the food's so expensive. Usher in a global collapse like Brexit, and you suddenly don't ask questions anymore because disruptions would be part of a financial crisis. EU bank stocks at all-time lows, Italian banks collapsing, British bank stocks down. They suspended trading a few days ago. German banks down. Now there's a giant liquidity injection from the Bank of International Settlements as well as all the central banks to try to prop this up until September or October. But at that point in September, it goes down, the Titanic sinks, and you're on the edge watching this thing go into the water. Now, to make sure the financial collapse happens, they put this into law 20 years ago. They had advanced knowledge of when this downturn in our climate would happen. They're requiring people to withdraw their 401k funds, which is going to pull more money out of the stock market and usher in a collapse as well. This would do it on its own. You can't keep printing money into infinity. They're keeping the system going as long as they can. Australia going to get smashed as well, and you can easily see why, because of the reduction in mining, the reduction in tourism, their grain production falling, and Australia drops from number 12 to number 51. You can see why. Take a look at the Australian grain production. Most of that's going to go offline. Now, the last thing you'll need to do, you're going to need to control the narrative. You'll need to control the seed supplies, and you're going to need to control the food distribution. Now, can the effects be minimized, and who chooses who lives or dies during this time? Deagle.com calling for a 2 billion person loss of global population during these years. Control the narrative. A few families, a few companies control all the media across the planet. Control the seed industry. You can see the big players there control all the seed distribution. Control the food production and delivery into our retail chain. There's just a handful of companies that control this. And the first global reduction in crop yields shall begin in the fall of 2017. This is going to intensify from each year, reducing the percentage of available food supply until the bottom of the cooling in 2024, 2025. Whoever's left at that point will have to just get through the next few years before the weather starts to warm again and we get our yields back. Now, the effects of the new grand solar minimum have already begun, and I truly wish you the best of luck in your preparations. But when it's coming out this much in your face, telling you which countries are going to decline, on how much, and which years, without a doubt, you need to prepare. Thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of the video. I personally believe this is my most important video that I've ever done.